Good morning. I hope you all are doing well and are as healthy as you can be. I hope you all are taking care of yourselves and each other. And hopefully, this short mini lecture on distributive justice and climate change will give you something to think about other than the news. So, today we're going to be looking at Henry Shue's article, Global Environment and International Inequality, and we're going to be talking about different principles for distributing adaptation, mitigation, and compensation burdens. We're going to be looking at different ways that we can assign responsibility for climate justice and analyze and evaluate the different ways that these principles could be justified and some of the implications that they might have for both political theory and public policy. Now, to get started, it's important to understand the connection between distributive justice and responsibility. That once we are raising the question that climate change is a question of justice, our immediate question, and this is a question that many of you have already asked in class and your minute papers, is who is responsible for climate change? How are we supposed to assign responsibility? And this question of responsibility actually refers to a few different things. On the one hand, it can be a question of accountability. Who is causally or morally responsible for bringing about the injustice of climate change? Usually we think about this in terms of who is responsible for the greatest number of greenhouse gas emissions. But responsibility also means more forward-looking responsibilities, and we already saw this a little bit with Iris Marion Young's work. But it means what are our obligations, or who should bear the costs of responding to climate change? And just as climate change is a question of distributive justice in terms of its effects on the world, um, it also is a question of distributive justice into how or should we distribute these obligations, these burdens, this accountability. We need to have a kind of distributive principle for allocating responsibility to take action in a fair way. We can think of this in a kind of Rawlsian sense, right? Are the responsibilities to respond to climate change being distributed in a way that free and rational people would accept behind original position of equality? And without knowing what is fair, without having a conception of fairness, it's really hard to know how we should assign responsibility. Because we usually tend to think that responsibility should track some sort of causal sense, right? That those who are contributed to the problem should bear the greatest responsibility to fix it. That's not, as we'll see today, necessarily always the case. So, before we get into some of the principles, we should also talk about what exactly we are distributing. On the one hand, we are distributing mitigation burdens. We can think of this as how much of the remaining carbon budget, the amount of greenhouse gases that we can still pump into the atmosphere before leading to catastrophic climate change, how much of that are we each entitled to? How should we divide up the remaining carbon budget? The IPCC's Special Report 15 that was released in the fall of 2018 says that if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that we have probably about 580 gigatons of greenhouse gas, of carbon dioxide left in the carbon budget. That's the amount that we can still emit into the atmosphere. So how are we going to distribute that remaining carbon budget? The second cost that we need to distribute is adaptation burdens. So how are we going to distribute the costs of measures taken to ensure human well-being given the inevitability of some warming and climate change? Who's going to pay for infrastructure, relocation? Who's going to pay for technology advances in sustainable energy? Who's going to finance these projects? Who's going to provide food and housing for dislocated people? Finally, since we are interested in questions of justice, we also want to provide for the distribution of the impacts. And since we can't directly redistribute climate impacts such as sea level rise, temperature rise, droughts, disease, extreme weather, etc., we need to have some sort of compensation scheme, right? How are we going to compensate those who are going to be the worst affected? Not just mitigate, not just adapt, but actually alleviate some of the pain and suffering that climate change is going to generate. Roser and Seidel, in a book called Climate Justice: An Introduction that was published in 2016, argued that this is one of the biggest challenges and is going to be, in their words, extremely tricky because there's not really one simple good to be defined. It's lots of different related goods that influence each other. And they argue that this is the largest and perhaps most difficult redistribution in human history. And we're going to try to solve this problem in today's lesson. Good luck to us. I've put on Moodle a chart that's uploaded as a Word document, so you can download it and fill this in as you're working along to kind of help you organize these different principles that we're going to be talking about today. Most of these are in the Shue reading, some of these are not, so I want to be able to help you keep these as clear in your head as possible. Now, the first principle that we're going to talk about is sometimes known as grandfathering, but it's also known as the equal burdens approach. And this means that every person or country equally contributes to the collective goal. And this doesn't mean necessarily equal in an absolute sense of equality, but a relative sense of equality. That everyone is going to make the same proportional investment. That if the goal is to cut emissions by 50% in 10 years, let's say, then every country will have to cut their emissions in half in 10 years. Let's look at what this would look like in practice. And that's the reason why this is called grandfathering is because the distribution of future emissions rights is a function of your past emissions, right? It's 50% of where you are to now. So if we look at this chart, and these are numbers from the Global Carbon Project, in 2016, the United States emitted 5.3 gigatons of carbon dioxide. India, which is in red here, 2.43 gigatons of carbon. Argentina, 0.21 gigatons of carbon. They're in that little sliver of blue. And you can barely see it if you have a very high resolution screen. You can see at less than 0.01 gigatons of carbon, Mozambique in green. Now, if the IPCC says we need to reduce global emissions in half by 2030, an intuitively reasonable solution would be for everyone to cut their emissions in half by the same period. And as you can see on the right-hand column here, this ultimately grandfathers in significant emissions from the United States, right? The United States is still going to be allowed to emit just about the same amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere after cutting 50% as India, Argentina, and Mozambique were combined in 2016 before their cuts. And this is why it's called grandfathering, because they basically get to keep those half of emissions. And it kind of rewards those who have already emitted a lot. They get to still continue emitting more. So why might this be a fair proposal? On the one hand, it has an intuitive, common sense conception of equality, right? That everyone puts in a fair amount, everyone equally contributes. There's also an argument here that people make that kind of building on the thought of John Locke and others, is that if you've appropriated something, you have a right to it. And so that the argument here is that countries and individuals have gained a right through their labor, through their energy use, to a certain level of standard of living based on greenhouse gas emissions, and that they have a right to it. Another argument why it's fair is that the people have a legitimate expectation of future lifestyles, that people have a legitimate expectation that they will be able to live in a certain way given how they have lived so far. As you can probably guess, this is also deeply criticized. First of all, it derives obligation from empirical description. It says the fact that the United States has already emitted more greenhouse gases in the past, that it should have a right to continue emitting more in the future. And as we've been talking about throughout this class, these past appropriations or expected future lifestyles, they have caused and will cause harm. And so it's hard to maintain this point that in the fairness column that there's a right or a legitimate expectation of these things that cause harm. And this will basically entrench existing inequalities. So while it does meet a kind of common sense conception of fairness, it does also entrench existing inequalities in the global system. So for this reason, Henry Shue in your reading argues that we can justify unequal burdens of responsibility. He argues that when one is beginning from an existing inequality, like the current inequality in wealth between North and South, three critical kinds of justification exist. Justifications of unequal burdens intended to reduce or eliminate the existing inequality by removing an unfair advantage for those at the top. Justifications of unequal burdens intended to prevent the existing inequality from becoming worse. And justifications of a guaranteed minimum intended to prevent the existing inequality from becoming worse through any infliction of an unfair additional disadvantage upon those at the bottom. The idea here is that when there is already existing inequalities, that it is justified to assign unequal burdens to reflect those existing inequalities. And so we'll work through 4 such potential principles now. The first is the polluter pays principle. And this is what Shue calls the greater contribution to the problem in the reading, but most of the literature refers to this as the polluter pays principle. And Shue defines this on page 103 as when a party has in the past taken an unfair advantage of others by imposing costs upon them without their consent, those who have been unilaterally put at a disadvantage are entitled to demand that in the future the offending party shoulder burdens that are unequal at least to the extent of the unfair advantage previously taken in order to restore equality. Essence, this is you break it, you buy it. Those who have emitted the most greenhouse gases are responsible for bearing the greatest amount of burdens. And much of United States environmental law takes this principle at its core, the idea that like those who are responsible for pollution should pay some sort of liability for that pollution. And in the context of climate change, it would require those who are the most responsible for carbon emissions to bear the greatest amounts of the costs of mitigating or adapting to climate change or paying restitution or compensation damages to those who are most affected. So why might we think this is a fair solution to the problem? Well, it resolves an unfair advantage or an ill-gotten gain, right? We can say that you got wealthy, you got rich, you got a certain standard of living by causing a problem, and this is a way to resolve that illegitimate problem. It also is based on the idea that you can't pass the costs on to other people while you enjoy the benefits. You cannot inflict suffering on other people while enjoying the benefits. That is intuitively unfair. But many people have criticized the polluter pays principle. On the one hand, there's an argument that everyone benefits from polluting behavior, that even least developed countries, LDCs, benefit from carbon-intensive technological and economic development, both in their countries and in the rest of the world, that a rising tide lifts all boats. Many also argue that there is unintentional pollution. All of us are consuming energy right now, listening to this video or recording this video, and none of us are intending to cause climate change, but we are still releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. There's also the thorny problem of intergenerational responsibility that we've discussed. That is it fair to hold children responsible for their parents' faults? Who is going to be held responsible for the pollution of past generations who have already died? So in response to some of these challenges, Shue and others have introduced a principle called the beneficiary pays principle. And this is a principle articulated most clearly by Simon Caney in a piece that we'll actually read at the end of the week, but I wanted to bring it in here. And he writes, if the current inhabitants of an industrialized countries have benefited from a policy of fossil fuel consumption, that the policy contributes to a process that harms others, then they are not entitled to consume fossil fuels to the same degree. Their standard of living is higher than it otherwise would have been, and they must pay a cost for that. And here is the idea that we need to adapt the polluter pays principle to deal with the fact that climate change is an intergenerational problem. And so if your quality of life and well-being are an unjust benefit from the fossil fuel expenditures of previous generations, then you have an obligation to relinquish some of that benefit in response. So why might this be fair? Again, we have this intuitive idea that you shouldn't benefit from the harm done to others, right? You can think of this in a more obvious example. If your great-great-grandfather was a mafia boss and left you a very large inheritance, but did so through a series of illegal activities and murders that many people suffered and died from, that it would be unfair for you to benefit from that harm done to others. Additionally, the idea here is that no one has the right to what was acquired. That you don't have a natural right to the benefits that you would hear from. This is that Rawlsian idea that we've come back to several times, that you don't choose where you are born, and therefore it's unfair to reap the benefits of the actions of past generations, especially if those benefits are coming at a cost to others. Again, this has been criticized in the literature. On the one hand, it suffers from the non-identity problem. We usually think of it going forward, but we can also go backwards, right? If our previous generations had chosen a different energy policy, it's entirely likely that none of us would exist. And so we can't be said to have benefited from that because those decisions are responsible for our existence. Additionally, the kind of Rawlsian idea can cut both ways, that precisely because we didn't have a choice over where we were born or the circumstances of our birth, that it seems unfair to punish us and say that we owe additional restitution for that. There's also been arguments made, and this is less of a concern in the United States, but as China overtakes the United States in emissions, but what about the emissions? What if the state isn't democratic? What about the institutional quality? Do people actually make choices and should they be held accountable for the choices they're made in authoritarian regimes? So another kind of school of thought has tried to bypass this whole question of causality and relationship to the harm by adopting what's called a ability to pay principle, the APP. Now, the ability to pay principle is very straightforward. Basically, the ability to pay principle says that among a number of parties, all of whom are bound to contribute to some common endeavor, the parties who have the most resources should contribute to the most to the endeavor. If you have the most money, you should have to pay the most. This is our idea in the progressive tax system, right? That it's not about causality; it's about that we can generate the most income from assigning greater burdens to the wealthiest. Why is this fair? Well, it's on the one hand, it is sensitive to the concrete circumstances of people and final outcomes, right? It's saying that it doesn't matter that it's more sensitive to principles of like if you are poor but you still have a high carbon footprint because you have to commute to work in a large distance, you can't afford a Tesla, you can't afford a hybrid car. This is saying that it's not about necessarily your causal contribution, but it's about how what are your resources now, and those with the greatest resources should be expected to pay more. Those with the fewest resources should be expected to pay less. Others argue that it's more effective, that you can raise more money and you can generate more, you can do more good by having those with the most resources foot the bill. Now, it's unfair or it's been challenged for being unfair for a couple of reasons. On the one hand, people have argued that there's a disincentivizing effect. Why bother taking risks trying to make money if you're going to end up having to pay more? That this can actually disincentivize the type of risk-taking and entrepreneurship that is necessary to grow the economies, lift people out of poverty, and develop new technologies to help fight climate change. Similarly, or conversely, people argue that causal responsibility should matter, that those who cause a harm should bear a special responsibility to rectifying that harm. So, shifting away entirely, Shue suggests one more principle, that in responding to cases of radical inequality, where some people have so little that they cannot live a decent life, and the situation cannot easily be resolved without placing a great burden on someone else, that this is an unnecessary inequality. And Shue argues that when we have situations where we have some people living like Scrooge McDuck and others barely able to survive, that we have an obligation to provide a guaranteed minimum. When some people have less than enough for a decent human life, other people have far more than enough, and the total resources available are so great that everyone could have at least enough without preventing some people from still retaining considerably more than others have. It is unfair not to guarantee everyone at least an adequate minimum. We can think of an example of this in another context as Andrew Yang's proposal for a universal basic income. We can think of this as kind of the Rawlsian minimax principle, right? That like everyone should have at least a bare minimum. So this is when we're talking about a question of climate change. Means that we need to redistribute resources in such that the most vulnerable to climate change at least have a bare minimum to survive, and that means often that the wealthiest are going to have to pay greater burdens. So why is this a fair principle? On the one hand, it starts to resolve this unnecessary inequality in Shue's words. It starts to alleviate the underlying inequality that, as we saw with the Parks and Roberts reading, really exacerbates the climate crisis. Additionally, there's this intuitive moral idea that everyone should have the ability to provide for their basic needs. We saw this with Nussbaum in Holland and Lynch, that everyone should be able to live a meaningful and flourishing life, and therefore that we have to guarantee those minimum requirements. Shue also argues, on page 108 of your reading, that children are going to be the main beneficiaries of this principle of equity. Children who have done nothing wrong. They can't make choices yet to contribute to climate change. So it makes sense that we should alleviate the suffering of children. Now, why might this be unfair? Many argue that it should be limited to a national context, that a guaranteed, and this is what we saw with Thomas Nagel, that a guaranteed minimum at the global context is going to create both practical and normative conflicts. But many others have also argued that it's just too strong of an obligation, that it's to guarantee well-being for everyone is just basically impossible. And we saw this with critiques of Singer, that it's going to be impossible to provide for every single one's guaranteed minimum. And so others have argued for a weaker form of this obligation, that we should not interfere with others' ability to maintain a basic minimum for themselves. This is a kind of watered down version of the guaranteed minimum principle. But the idea here is that like this isn't just alleviating the effects of climate change, but would require a fundamental reorganization of our global economic and political system. Now, we've talked about the differences between these principles, but if we think about it, the guaranteed minimum principle, the ability to pay principle, the beneficiary pays principle, the polluter pays principle, all of them actually lead to the same practical conclusion, that the wealthiest states have a bigger responsibility to respond to climate change than the rest of the world. That Shue writes on page 111 of the reading, in spite of the different content of these three principles of equity, and in spite of the different kinds of grounds upon which they rest, they all converge upon the same practical conclusion. Whatever needs to be done by wealthy industrialized states or by poor non-industrialized states about global environmental problems like the ozone destruction and global warming, the cost should initially be borne by the wealthy industrialized states. So what we're really talking about today is different ways of normatively or ethically justifying why states like the United States, like Western states in Western Europe, should be responsible for bearing a greater proportion of the burden of responding to climate change. That all of these lead to the same conclusion, but they have different normative justifications. So next class, we're going to raise some challenges for these theories of responsibility. We're going to look at two pieces, one by Dale Jamieson and one by Walterson and Armstrong, both in the Climate Ethics reader. And again, if you don't have your physical copy of it, you can use the virtual copy that the library has, the Oxy library has, a digital subscription copy. And while you're reading these texts, think about whether our ordinary concepts of responsibility are even adequate to make sense of climate change. Both Jameson and Sinnott Armstrong raise some severe challenges about whether we can really assign responsibility in the way that we usually think about responsibility for climate change. Now, after you've watched this lecture, and think back to the reading and think about which of the principles of responsibility do you find the most ethically or morally justifiable and why? Which do you think will be the most politically or rhetorically effective? Why? Now, if you have an odd student ID number, you're responsible for posting a 200-word response by 11:59 p.m. Pacific time tonight. And those of you with even student ID numbers, please comment of about 100 words to a peer's post by 11:59. That should be 59 out of 56 p.m. Pacific time tomorrow. And those threads are in the post-class discussion thread forum on the Moodle site. If you have any questions, if you're having trouble finding those discussion threads, the question's already uploaded, but send me an email and I will help you. Thanks for tuning in. I will update with the next lecture on Wednesday, and stay safe, stay healthy. I'm always here on email if you have any questions. Take care.